On the morning of the 18th of November 2019, a 54-year-old detective named Musi Mackay stood in a long, slow-moving line. He was waiting to get into a courthouse in the city of Ikapa, South Africa. Musi was an investigator, a good one, and today he was on court duty for a very violent robbery case that was, at long last, finally going to trial. The robbery itself had happened nearly 6 years earlier, a lifetime ago in police work. Back in 2014, a group of armed men had stormed into a couple's farmhouse just outside of the city. It was a brutal, terrifying home invasion. The men beat the couple severely before they ransacked the home, making off with everything they could carry: electronics, jewelry, a collection of firearms, and other valuables. It was Musi and his team who had worked the case tirelessly. They eventually identified, tracked down, and arrested the criminals responsible. And in a stroke of good police work, they were even able to recover some of the stolen items. Now, as he stood in that line, Musi was holding one of those recovered items. It was a piece of evidence he was scheduled to present in court today. He had done this kind of thing countless times over his long career. Stand in court, present the facts, show the evidence. It was part of the job. But today, he felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was different. It wasn't just the trial prep. He was juggling other active cases, mentoring junior detectives who looked up to him, and he was feeling every one of his 54 years. Musi wasn't the young, energetic officer he used to be. He was getting close to retirement age, and the weight of all his obligations was starting to press down on him. The biggest source of his fatigue, though, was this robbery case itself. It had been an excruciatingly long and complicated process. There were an unusual number of delays, legal challenges, and procedural hurdles that had dragged it out for 6 long years. It had taken so long to bring this case to trial that the very piece of evidence Musi was now holding had actually been returned to the victim couple. The system figured they might as well get to use their property again until the court finally got its act together. Getting the case to this point had been a marathon, not a sprint, and it had drained him. But Musi and his team were absolutely determined to see it through. The men they had arrested weren't petty thieves. They were incredibly violent. They needed to be behind bars, for the good of the public. They had beaten the couple so badly that both of them had ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. It was a miracle they hadn't been killed during the home invasion. Justice, however delayed, was essential. As Musi finally reached the front of the line and entered the courthouse, he passed through the security checkpoint. He gave the guards a nod, hoping they were on high alert today. In his experience, violent offenders, like the ones on trial, often had equally violent friends, especially in this region where this kind of crime was unfortunately common. It wasn't unheard of for associates or gang members to try and disrupt court proceedings, sometimes even retaliating against police officers or the prosecution right there in the courthouse. But the security check was smooth. There were no suspicious people loitering, no signs of any trouble. Musi felt a small measure of relief as he made his way down the corridor and into the designated courtroom. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and saw that the room was already full. The defense team was there, the jury was seated, and the public gallery was packed with observers. He walked towards the front of the court. Musi went over and took a seat at the prosecution table. He would stay there until it was his turn to approach the judge and present the state's case, which would include him formally introducing this piece of evidence. As he got settled into his chair, he placed the evidence carefully in his lap. He turned and gave a quick, subtle wave to the prosecutor, a woman named Adelaide Ferreira-Watt, who was sitting next to him at the table. She was deeply focused, reviewing her notes one last time. Musi had worked with Adelaide on several cases before. They had a good working relationship, built on mutual respect. In his mind, she was a total professional, sharp, and dedicated. He knew that with her leading the prosecution, their chances of getting a conviction were very strong. Adelaide looked up, saw his wave, and returned it with a brief, confident smile before her eyes went back to the papers in front of her. Musi took another slow look around the courtroom. Everything seemed quiet, orderly. There was no sign of any gang members or friends of the accused trying to intimidate anyone. The air was still and tense with anticipation, as it always was before a major trial began. Musi just hoped it would stay that way. He hoped the trial would go smoothly and end with the verdict he and the victims had waited 6 long years for. A few minutes later, the judge entered, called the court to order, and the trial officially began. Adelaide stood up, straightened her robes, and began to present the case for the prosecution. At that very moment, despite waiting all these years to finally get here, Musi didn't feel a surge of adrenaline or excitement. Instead, a profound wave of exhaustion washed over him. It was almost like relief, the feeling that the final chapter was beginning and his long involvement was almost over. The courtroom was also quite warm, stuffy from all the bodies packed inside. The combination of the heat and his deep fatigue was potent. Before long, his eyelids started to feel heavy, like tiny weights were attached to them. He fought to keep them open, to focus on Adelaide's opening statement, but her voice began to sound distant, muffled. His head felt like it was filling with cotton. Eventually, his head slumped over to the side, his chin resting on his chest. And right there, in the middle of the trial he had worked so hard for, Musi MK dozed off. At first, everything was fine. For a couple of minutes, he slept, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The trial continued on around him. But then, a sudden, loud scraping sound ripped through the quiet of the courtroom. It was the sound of dozens of wooden chair legs being dragged across the floor all at once. The jarring noise woke Musi up abruptly. He was startled, his heart pounding in his chest. As he jolted awake, disoriented and confused, the evidence he had been holding in his lap slipped from his grasp. It clattered onto the floor beneath the table. He blinked, trying to get his bearings. He was embarrassed. Had anyone seen him sleeping? What was that noise? He saw that people were getting up, moving around. He looked down and saw the evidence on the floor. His first instinct was to get it back before anyone noticed his blunder. He ducked under the table, scooped the item back up, and as he was sitting back up in his chair, he heard a deafening bang echo through the courtroom. It was sharp, explosive, and utterly out of place. He still had no idea what was going on. The room had erupted into chaos. And then he heard a scream coming from his right. He turned his head and realized the scream had come from the prosecutor, Adelaide. Musi looked over the table and saw her on the ground. She was clutching her hip, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across her clothing. Her hip was gushing blood. She had been attacked. That loud bang he had heard, it was almost certainly a gunshot. Musi's mind instantly jumped to his earlier fear. The criminal's friends must have stormed the courthouse. They had gotten a weapon inside, and they had attacked them. They had shot Adelaide. His training kicked in. Were there more shooters? Were there other attackers in the building? Musi, who had only been awake for about 30 seconds, was still trying to process the frantic scene. He began scanning the courtroom, looking for a perpetrator, a gunman, anyone who looked like they were part of an attack. But he saw nothing of the sort. All he saw was the chaos of terrified people trying to flee the room and a few brave individuals rushing towards Adelaide to try and help her, to render aid. There were no attackers. There were no gunmen. There was just panic and confusion. For a moment, Musi just sat there, almost paralyzed by the shock of it all. He was still shaking off the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of the scene in front of him. He looked around the chaotic courthouse again, his eyes darting from face to face. No gunman, no perpetrator, nothing. And as that fact settled in his mind, it could only mean one thing. A cold, horrifying realization began to creep into his mind as he looked down at the object he now held in his hands. To understand what really happened inside that courtroom, you first have to understand a specific detail about South African police procedure. Normally, as in most countries, after evidence is collected from a crime scene, it's carefully examined, cataloged, and made safe. Then, it's transferred to a secure exhibit room where it stays under lock and key until it's time for trial. This ensures the integrity of the evidence and the safety of everyone in the court. However, in South Africa, there can be exceptions to this strict procedure, especially in cases with extreme delays. And this trial, as we know, had taken almost 6 years just to get started. Because of that immense time lag, some of the evidence recovered from the robbers' hideout has been returned to the original victims. The shotgun that was stolen from their farmhouse was one of those items. The idea was that they should be allowed to have their property back while the justice system took its sweet time. When the trial was finally scheduled, the couple had returned that particular piece of evidence to the police that very morning. Detective Musi McKay had been the one charged with bringing it to court. He was responsible for holding on to it. But in the rush of preparing for the long-awaited day, a critical step was missed. Musi, or someone on his team, had failed to double-check the evidence, to re-examine it, and make sure it was safe to be brought into a crowded courtroom. Sometime after Musi had fallen asleep, the judge had announced a short recess. The loud scraping of chairs that had startled him awake was simply the sound of everyone getting up to take a break. But for Musi, deep in sleep, the sudden noise was like an explosion. He had sat up suddenly, confused, and in that disoriented moment, he dropped the evidence onto the floor. And it turned out that was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Because that particular piece of evidence was the shotgun recovered from the robbers. When Musi, in his panicked, instinctive state, saw the shotgun on the ground, he had one thought: get it back before the judge or prosecutor saw that he'd fallen asleep and dropped it. He reached down quickly to scoop it up. But the shotgun, because it had never been re-examined after being returned by the victims, was still loaded. And as Musi hastily grabbed it from under the table, his finger accidentally hit the trigger. The gun fired. The blast hit Adelaide Ferreira-Watt in the hip, severing a major artery. The wound was catastrophic, and it would prove to be fatal. Musi was so confused by the chaos and the suddenness of it all that at first he didn't even realize he had been the one to fire the gun. He just scooped it up, heard the bang, and immediately thought they were under attack. It was only when he scanned the room and found no gunman, no other explanation, that he looked down at the shotgun in his own hands. And he realized it was aimed in the direction of where Adelaide had been standing. He must have been the one who shot her. In the end, Musi MK pleaded guilty to culpable homicide and negligence. For his role in the tragic death of his colleague, he was ordered to serve a 6-year prison sentence. However, that sentence was fully suspended. On the morning of the 14th of July, 1912, a 21-year-old athlete named Francisco Lazaro stood in his hotel room in Stockholm, Sweden. He was carefully getting dressed, preparing himself for the most important day of his life. Francisco was in Sweden to run the marathon in the Olympic Games. A marathon is a grueling long-distance race covering exactly 26.2 miles. For the world's most elite runners, it typically takes between 2 and 3 hours to complete. Francisco was representing his home country of Portugal. And this was a very big deal for everyone back home. It was Portugal's very first time participating in the Olympics, which meant Francisco was one of only a handful of Portuguese athletes at the Games. And out of all of them, Francisco genuinely believed he stood the best chance of bringing home a medal. He had a chance to do something truly historic, to put his country on the sporting map. Realistically, he wasn't even that nervous. He knew he was an incredible runner, one of the best in the world. Even though he was only 21, Francisco had already won 3 major marathons in Portugal. He was a star back home, a national hero in the making. But he also knew that winning on the world stage at the Olympics would require him to be more prepared than he had ever been in his life. So that's exactly what he had done. He had trained for months, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He had recently undergone a full medical examination to confirm he was in peak physical health. And he had even spent weeks thinking about the little details, the small ways he could give himself an edge over the competition. He thought about what to eat, what to drink, what to put in his body, and even what to put on his body. He knew that even the smallest thing, like a shirt that wasn't breathable or eating something that sat too heavily in his stomach, could be the difference between winning a gold medal and finishing in last place. The margins at this level were razor thin. Any little edge he could find, he was going to take it. So now, on the morning of the race, Francisco spent the next hour meticulously putting on the specific clothes he had selected and eating a perfectly balanced, light meal of carbohydrates and protein. It was all part of the plan he had mapped out. He had also been warned by race officials that it was supposed to be extremely hot on race day. But Francisco actually saw this as an advantage. He was from Portugal, where it often got much hotter than in a place like Sweden. He was used to the heat. He felt he knew how to protect himself from the sun and how to use the sweltering weather to his advantage against runners from cooler climates. Before he knew it, Francisco was ready. He left his hotel room and made his way to the stadium to compete in the Olympic marathon. A few hours later, around 1:45 in the afternoon, Francisco walked out into the middle of Stockholm's massive sun-drenched stadium where the race was set to begin. As race officials directed him and the 67 other competitors to their places at the starting line, Francisco was feeling incredibly confident. So confident, in fact, that he called out to a nearby reporter who was covering the event. He told the reporter, with a grin, that he was going to be the winner, famously declaring, "I win or I die." As Francisco and the other runners took their spots on the starting line, they were standing in the direct sunlight, and it was unbelievably hot. In the shade, at the edge of the stadium, the temperature was already 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a sweltering, oppressive day. As Francisco looked up and down the line of his competitors, he saw that many of them already looked flushed. Their faces were red, and they were sweating profusely. They didn't look ready to run 26.2 miles in this heat. They looked overwhelmed before the race had even begun. But Francisco wasn't overwhelmed. He was prepared. In fact, he wasn't even sweating. As he stood there, waiting for the race to start, he could hear the roar of the thousands of people who had packed the stands. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in, appreciating how special this moment was. The marathon was a major event at these Olympics. The stadium was completely sold out. Even the King and Queen of Sweden were rumored to be somewhere in the crowd, watching. And as Francisco stood there, soaking in the atmosphere, he felt a deep certainty that when this race was over, all those people in the stadium and people all around the world, even royalty, would know his name. Just then, he heard the announcer's voice boom over the loudspeaker, telling the runners to take their marks. Francisco felt a surge of adrenaline. A hush fell over the crowd. He and the rest of the racers stopped moving, tensing their bodies, waiting for the signal. A few seconds passed in complete silence, and then, bang, the starting gun went off. Francisco and everyone else lunged forward. There was a bit of jostling as all the competitors surged off the line together, and Francisco found himself pushed back towards the middle of the pack. Right off the bat, he was a little surprised by how quick the pace was. But he still wasn't worried. He had studied the course maps extensively, and he knew he would have his chance to get out in front later on. This particular marathon route was very flat, but Francisco was used to competing in Portugal, which had much more mountainous and hilly terrain. So, he was sure that once the other runners inevitably started to get tired, especially from the blistering heat, he would still be feeling fine. He could make his move then. So, Francisco decided to hang back, conserve his energy, and wait for the right moment as the pack of runners moved out of the stadium and onto the dirt roads beyond. For the next hour and a half, he stuck to his plan. He kept his pace steady, running comfortably in the middle of the group. He knew that at some point, runners would start falling off as the heat and the distance wore them down. He would be able to make his way up through the field then. He wasn't rushing. He was just waiting, biding his time, staying confident. In fact, as he was keeping his pace, he was even able to give another quick soundbite to a reporter who was covering the race from the side of the road, telling her that he was feeling great. For the first half of this marathon, Francisco Lazaro felt like he was running the race of his life. It was as if everything in his training, his preparation, and his background had led him to this moment, to excel here on the world stage. He was consistently and easily moving past other runners. Some of them were really struggling in the heat, clearly not used to it. He saw some who had stopped running altogether, bent over with their hands on their knees, gasping for air. Others were just sitting on the side of the road, unable to get up. Basically, everything was playing out exactly the way Francisco had expected it to. He was slowly but surely making his move towards the front of the pack. However, as great as this race was going for him, something changed at around the 19-mile mark. All of a sudden, he just felt really off. His legs suddenly felt incredibly heavy, like they were made of lead. A few minutes later, his vision started to get blurry at the edges. Francisco kept running, telling himself he was fine, that this was just late race fatigue kicking in. And to be fair, it is pretty common for marathon runners to say that the real halfway point of the race isn't at 13 miles, but at around the 19 or 20 mile mark. That's the point where your body really starts to struggle. That last 6 miles is notoriously brutal. So he tried to rationalize it, telling himself that this was normal, that this happens when you hit mile 20. As Francisco worked as hard as he could to just put one foot in front of the other to keep going, he began telling himself that this pain was worth it. At the end of this, there was a stadium packed with people who would be screaming his name. He was still making such great progress. He could still win this race. But then, just a little bit later, his legs went from feeling heavy to completely giving out from under him. He slammed hard onto the hot, dusty ground, and then his whole body began to convulse. Within the hour, at a local hospital, an emergency doctor greeted a crew of Olympic medical staff as they wheeled a man in on a stretcher. They quickly explained that the man's name was Francisco Lazaro and that he had collapsed in the middle of the marathon. The doctor wasn't particularly surprised by this. He knew the Olympic paramedics had been swamped all day, helping other marathon runners who had gotten sick from the oppressive heat. However, as soon as this doctor began to examine Francisco specifically, he knew that this case was different. It was much, much more serious. The other patients he had seen that day all had relatively mild symptoms, things like excessive sweating, general fatigue, and dizziness. They had all been easily treated by giving them water and cooling them off. But Francisco was twitching and convulsing uncontrollably. He was shouting deliriously, claiming that he had won the race. The doctor rushed him into an exam room and immediately took his temperature. When he saw the reading, he knew the situation was critical. It was 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit. A body temperature that high was often fatal. Francisco's organs were likely already shutting down. The doctor yelled for nurses and other medical staff to bring in water and ice, anything to cool him down. But Francisco did not respond to any of the hospital's treatments. As the hours passed by, his condition actually got worse. The doctor and his team worked tirelessly through the night, treating Francisco and trying to stabilize him. But the next morning, Francisco Lazaro died. After his death, that doctor just could not shake the feeling that something was off about what had happened. Yes, heat stroke can definitely be deadly, and Francisco had presented with a very severe case of it. But lots of other runners had gotten heat stroke during that same marathon, and all of them had recovered and were ultimately fine. So the doctor decided to run some tests on Francisco's body to see if maybe there was something else going on, perhaps an underlying illness or some other factor that was to blame for his tragic death. And when the doctor finally got those test results back, the answer made Francisco Lazaro famous all over the world. Remember, Francisco had put an incredible amount of thought into how to prepare for his big race. He trained hard, he ate right, he chose the perfect clothes, and critically, he took very specific measures to protect himself from the heat, which he knew was going to be a major factor. And at first, it seemed like all the measures he had taken had paid off. When he looked down the starting line and saw all the other runners pouring with sweat, their faces flushed, it seemed like they were already exhausted. But not Francisco. He wasn't even sweating. But not sweating in that kind of extreme heat was actually a very, very bad thing. Sweat is the body's natural and essential way of cooling itself down. When sweat evaporates from the skin, it takes heat with it. So Francisco's lack of sweat was actually a giant red flag, a sign that his body was in serious danger. And it was all thanks to what he thought was his secret weapon against the sun. It would turn out that Francisco, so determined to be prepared, had gone out and found what he believed would be the best and most powerful sunscreen imaginable. It was a substance called suet, which is a type of hard animal fat that's typically used in cooking or for making things like candles and soap. It's also sometimes used in skincare products because it's rich in nutrients. Francisco believed that because suet is so thick and waxy, it would act as a powerful barrier, protecting his skin from the intensity of the sun. So, just before the race, he had slathered a thick layer of suet all over his body. What he didn't anticipate was that this layer of fat would work far too well. It was so thick and non-porous that it clogged every pore in his skin. It created an impermeable seal, preventing anything from passing through, including his own sweat. And without any way to cool itself down, Francisco's body essentially turned into a furnace. As he ran for miles in the scorching heat, his internal temperature just kept climbing higher and higher, effectively cooking him from the inside out. The weekend after Francisco Lazaro's death, the Olympics held a memorial service for him. Over 20,000 people attended to pay their respects. It probably wasn't the kind of fame he had dreamed of when he stood on that starting line, but Francisco's name is still frequently referenced in Portugal today. When someone looks sick, pale, and bedraggled, the Portuguese sometimes say that they look like Lazaro. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine living in a city of over 3.5 million people, where the streets are a constant roaring sea of traffic, dust, and heat. This is Ibadan, one of the largest and most populated cities in Nigeria. In a place this massive, it is incredibly easy to feel lost or ignored. But for a specific group of young men, they found their community on the back of two wheels. In Nigeria, motorcycle taxi drivers are known as Okadas. They are the lifeblood of Ibadan, weaving through gridlock to get people to work, school, and home. Because their job is tough and often dangerous, the Okada riders developed a remarkably tight-knit brotherhood. They would gather at specific spots along the city streets, waiting for fares, sharing food, and talking about their lives. They looked out for one another. If a rider went down, the others would help him. If a rider got into trouble with a difficult customer, a dozen others would show up to back him up. They knew each other's routines, families, and dreams. So, in the early months of 2014, when two of these riders suddenly stopped showing up to their usual spots, the entire Okada community noticed immediately. At first, their friends and families held out hope that maybe they had just taken a long-distance fare or gone to visit relatives in another town. But, as the days turned into weeks, the silence grew deafening. The families went to the local police to report the men missing, but the police did not seem to care very much. They brushed the families off, suggesting that the young men had probably just walked away from their lives to find better jobs in a different city, or that they had simply run off to avoid some debts. The Okada riders knew this was not true. These men loved their jobs and would never just abandon their families and their valuable motorcycles without saying a word. Realizing that the authorities were not going to lift a finger, the Okadas decided to take matters into their own hands. They launched an informal, citywide search. As they went about their daily shifts, dropping off passengers in every corner of Ibadan, they kept their eyes peeled. They rode down narrow side streets, checked dark alleys, and asked shopkeepers if they had seen their missing brothers. But despite their constant vigilance, they found absolutely nothing. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. Then, on March 22nd of that same year, a third Okada rider vanished. His name was Lanre Sadiku. Lanre was a young, hard-working guy who was incredibly popular among his peers. He was always smiling, quick with a joke, and incredibly reliable. Unlike the first two riders who had disappeared during their off hours, Lanre went missing right in the middle of a busy workday. On that afternoon, Lanre was hanging out at his usual meetup spot on a bustling city street, waiting for his next fare. His fellow riders were right there with him, chatting and enjoying the afternoon sun. Eventually, two men walked up to Lanre and asked for a ride. Lanre agreed. The two passengers climbed onto the back of his motorcycle, and he kicked the engine over and drove away. In Ibadan, Okada trips are typically very short. Drivers usually take passengers just a few miles down the road, drop them off, and head straight back to their designated stations to pick up the next fare. It was an assembly line of quick trips. But as the afternoon faded into evening, Lanre still had not returned. At first, his friends at the meetup spot figured he might have landed a rare, high-paying passenger who wanted to go all the way to the other side of the city. But when 3 hours passed, then 4, a deep sense of unease settled over the group. One of the riders pulled out his phone and dialed Lanre's number. It went straight to voicemail. This was highly unusual. For an Okada rider, a cell phone is their most vital business tool. It is how clients reach them, how they coordinate rides, and how they make their living. They never, under any circumstances, turned their phones off during a shift. Now, everyone at the station was deeply worried. They stood in a circle, debating what to do, when suddenly a phone began to ring. But it was not the phone they had just called. Lanre actually kept 2 cell phones on him. He had his main, public work phone, and then he had a private, secondary phone that only his closest friends and family knew about. And it was this second, private phone that was now calling one of the riders at the station. The rider answered the call instantly and put it on speakerphone so everyone could hear. But instead of a casual greeting from Lanre, the speaker erupted with a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Lanre was screaming hysterically into the receiver. His voice was cracked, frantic, and filled with tears. He was begging for help. He told his friends that he had been kidnapped. He explained that his captors had blindfolded him and thrown him into an underground room. He said he was not alone. There were 8 other people down there with him, individuals he had never seen before in his life, and they were all locked in this pitch-black, suffocating underground cell. Lanre said they could hear the heavy, muffled footsteps of people walking around on the ceiling directly above them, but they could not see anything at all. In the background of the call, the other riders could hear a terrifying chorus of screams and wails. The other 8 captives were screaming as loud as they possibly could, trying to make enough noise so that whoever was walking above them might hear them and let them out, or perhaps hoping the voice on the other end of the line would hear their desperation. Lanre explained that when they were captured, the kidnappers had aggressively searched them and confiscated all of their belongings, including their wallets and their primary cell phones. But in their haste, the kidnappers had completely missed the small secondary phone that Lanre kept tucked away in a hidden pocket. That tiny mistake was their only lifeline. The riders holding the phone were absolutely horrified. They tried to calm Lanre down, shouting into the speaker for him to take a deep breath and tell them where he was so they could come get him. Lanre took a ragged breath and tried to compose himself. He told them he did not know the exact coordinates, but he had managed to pay close attention to the route while he was being transported. He told them they needed to get onto the main highway leading out of Ibadan and head toward the outskirts of the city. He said they needed to look for the dense, dark tree line of the Soka forest. Right at the edge of the woods, where a narrow dirt footpath began, they would see two rusted, burned-out cars. Lanre told them that if they found those cars and followed that footpath deep into the Soka forest, they would eventually hear the voices of the captives crying out from beneath the ground. He begged them to hurry, because he did not know how much time he had left before the captors returned and discovered his hidden phone. The riders at the station yelled back that they were coming right now. They told him to stay on the line to keep talking to them so they could use his voice as a guide once they entered the woods. But right as they said those words, the line abruptly went dead. They tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. The phone had either been turned off, run out of battery, or worse, discovered by the kidnappers. There was no time to lose. Approximately 40 Okada riders from Lanre's meetup spot immediately ran to their bikes, kicked them into gear, and roared out onto the city streets. They drove in a massive, tight formation, weaving through traffic and ignoring traffic lights as they sped toward the highway. They pushed their motorcycles to their absolute limits until they left the concrete jungle of Ibadan behind and the dark, imposing trees of the Soka forest appeared on their left. They slowed down, scanning the shoulder of the road, looking for the landmark Lanre had described. Sure enough, after a few miles, they spotted the skeletal, rusted remains of two burned-out cars parked right at the edge of the woods. The riders pulled over, parking their bikes on the side of the highway. They looked at the entrance to the footpath. It was incredibly narrow and heavily overgrown with thick vines, tall weeds, and dense brush. It was completely impassable for their motorcycle. They realized they would have to continue on foot. Unarmed and completely unprepared for what might lie ahead, the 40 men stepped past the rusted cars and onto the path. The forest was thick and dark, blocking out much of the late afternoon sun. Because the trail was so narrow, they had to walk in a single file line, moving quietly through the brush. They did not make a sound. They were straining their ears, trying to catch the faint sound of Lanre's voice or the screams of the other captives coming from beneath the dirt. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs under their boots. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Suddenly, the rider at the very front of the line froze. He holds up his hand, signaling for everyone behind him to stop. They all went dead silent, holding their breath, listening. Then, about 50 feet ahead of them, the thick foliage parted. A man they had never seen before leaped out from behind a massive tree. He screamed something at them in a harsh, angry tone. Before anyone could react, the man raised a heavy gun and began firing directly at the line of riders. The loud cracks of gunfire shattered the silence of the forest. The 40 Okada riders, completely defenseless, turned on their heels and sprinted back down the path as fast as their legs could carry them. They burst out of the tree line, threw themselves onto their motorcycles, and peeled out onto the highway, racing back toward the safety of the city. When they finally got back to their meetup spot, they were trembling and out of breath. They gathered in a tight circle to discuss what had just happened. They knew they could not just abandon Lanre and the other captives. If they did nothing, those people would surely die. They briefly considered going to the police, but after the lazy and dismissive response they had received regarding the first two missing riders, they knew the police would take hours, if not days, to organize any kind of response. By then, it would be far too late. They decided they had to handle this themselves, but they needed a much bigger force. The riders began calling every Okada meetup spot in the surrounding areas. They explained the situation, the phone call from Lanre, the gunman in the woods, and the urgent need for backup. The response was overwhelming. Within a very short amount of time, over 100 Okada riders assembled at the edge of the city. This time, they were not defenseless. They had gathered a makeshift arsenal of weapons. Some carried heavy iron bars, others had thick wooden clubs, sharp knives, machetes, and even a few crude firearms. They were no longer a helpless search party, they were an angry, determined mob. They climbed back onto their bikes and roared down the highway, a massive convoy of headlights cutting through the descending twilight. When they arrived back at the Soka forest, they parked their motorcycles in a massive row along the shoulder of the highway. They bypassed the two burned-out cars and marched onto the narrow footpath. But this time, they made absolutely no attempt to be quiet. They marched shoulder to shoulder where they could, waving their weapons in the air and letting out loud, terrifying war cries. They wanted the gunmen and anyone else hiding in those woods to know that a massive, angry horde was coming for them and they were ready for a fight. They marched deep into the forest, fully expecting to be shot at any moment. But the woods remained eerily quiet. The gunmen from before had apparently fled, terrified by the sheer volume of noise and the size of the incoming mob. After walking for what felt like miles through the dense vegetation, the path suddenly opened up. The thick trees gave way to a massive circular clearing in the middle of the forest. Flowing right through the center of this clearing was a small but deep river with fast-moving water. It would have been incredibly difficult to cross on foot, but spanning the water was an old, crumbling stone bridge. On the far side of this bridge, sitting in the gloomy twilight, were two dilapidated buildings. The first building, located closest to the bridge, was a small, weather-worn shack made of dark plywood. It had a single dirty window that looked out toward the path. The second building, situated further back in the clearing, was a massive warehouse-like structure with high, crumbling concrete walls. Surrounding this large warehouse was a tall, rusted chain-link fence with thick coils of rusty barbed wire wrapped tightly around the top. The entire place looked completely abandoned, like an old, forgotten industrial site rotting away in the middle of the wilderness. The mob of Okada riders slowed their pace as they stepped into the clearing, their eyes scanning the dark structures for any sign of movement. As they approached the crumbling stone bridge, one of the riders glanced down at the muddy banks of the river below. He gasped and pointed. Tucked away under the shadow of the stone arch, partially hidden by tall river reeds, was Lanre's motorcycle. It had been driven down here, pushed off the path, and hidden away. This was the absolute proof they needed. Lanre was here, or at least he had been very recently. The riders surged across the bridge, their anger and adrenaline reaching a boiling point. They ran straight to the small plywood shack. One of the men kicked the door open, ready to face an attacker, but the tiny building was empty. However, what they saw inside the shack made them pause in confusion. The small room was packed from floor to ceiling with hundreds and hundreds of articles of clothing. There were piles of shirts, pants, dresses, children's clothes, and hundreds of pairs of shoes. There were also wallets, bags, and personal identification cards scattered everywhere. It looked like a bizarre, silent museum of lost people. Confused and deeply unsettled, the mob backed out of the shack and turned their attention to the massive concrete warehouse behind the barbed wire fence. They stood before the fence, shouting for whoever was inside to show themselves, but only silence echoed back from the concrete walls. One of the riders had brought a pair of heavy bolt cutters to use as a club. He stepped forward, bent down, and began cutting through the thick metal links of the fence. He worked quickly, cutting a massive, jagged hole in the barrier. The riders squeezed through the opening one by one, stepping onto the overgrown ground inside the perimeter. The warehouse was silent. The windows were set very high up on the concrete walls, making it impossible to see inside. But as they walked around the perimeter of the building, a horrific, overpowering stench began to wash over them. It was the unmistakable, sweet, and sickening smell of decay. They continued around to the very back of the structure, where they finally found an entrance. The doorway was blocked by a large, rusted sheet of tin metal that had been propped up against the gap in the concrete wall. One of the riders stepped forward, grabbed the edge of the metal sheet, and dragged it aside with a loud scraping screech. A few of the armed riders immediately stepped through the threshold, holding their weapons high, ready to fight off any guards or kidnappers who might be waiting in the shadows. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim, dusty light inside the warehouse, their weapons slowly lowered. The anger faded from their faces, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. In the middle of the dirt floor lay a tilted concrete slab propped up on stones with a blood-stained wooden bowl positioned to catch runoff. Surrounding this slaughtering slab were human bones, some still with decaying flesh clinging to them. Along the walls, chained up like animals, were 23 skeletal, barely alive people who had been kept in a catatonic state. These captives were being systematically harvested for their body parts to fuel a highly lucrative, illegal black market trade in ritual magic materials. Herbalists in Nigeria paid massive sums for fresh human organs and limbs, believing they would grant wealth and power to their clients. The warehouse was essentially a body part factory where victims were kept alive and butchered on demand. In the back rooms, searchers also discovered a crude guillotine and a live chained crocodile, which the captors used to dispose of the dead or those who could no longer survive the harvesting process. According to the locals living nearby, they had seen a black Jeep with tinted windows drive down a rough, hidden path to the warehouse every single night at 8 o'clock for the last 10 years. Each night, the forest would echo with horrific, blood-curdling screams until the Jeep departed around 9:30. The locals had repeatedly complained to the police, but the police brushed them off and told them to ignore it. It turned out the driver of the Jeep was the primary distributor of the harvested parts, delivering them directly to wealthy clients. When the Okada mob stormed the property, the guards and the driver of the Jeep fled through the hidden road, leaving the survivors behind. The riders quickly smashed the heavy chains to free the 23 survivors, but as they searched the faces of the barely conscious victims, they realized Lanre was not among them. They began searching the mass graves outside, but there was still no trace of their missing friend. Lanre had said on the phone that he was locked in an underground cell, but the warehouse had a solid concrete floor. The Okadas desperately searched the property for a hidden entrance, hammering on the ground and begging the catatonic survivors for answers, but they got nothing. When the police finally arrived, the riders begged them to bring heavy digging equipment to excavate the site. Instead, the police cordoned off the area and, within days, brought in bulldozers to completely demolish the warehouse, burying any hidden chambers under a mountain of rubble. Many believed the police did this to cover up their own corruption and complicity. For weeks, the Okadas returned with shovels to dig through the debris, but they never found the underground cell. It is believed that Lanre and the other 8 captives remained trapped beneath the earth, suffocating in the dark. While no one was ever legally prosecuted, the Okadas did deliver a swift form of street justice. A few days after the discovery, they caught a suspicious man wandering the ruins with several fresh human tongues in his pockets and dozens of cell phone SIM cards. Assuming he was part of the harvesting ring, the mob killed him on the spot. Later, a well-educated survivor revealed how she had been kidnapped by men in a fake police van, stripped naked at the clothing shack, and chained inside the warehouse to watch others get butchered. Her story exposed how easily ordinary people were snatched from the safety of their homes to feed the insatiable demand of the black market. The Soka Forest remains a dark scar on the history of Ibadan, a place where hundreds of innocent people vanished into the shadows and where a frantic plea for help came just a few feet too late. The Soka Forest tragedy left the community of Ibadan in a state of absolute shock and mourning. For years, the families of the missing had been ignored, their desperate pleas for help treated as minor inconveniences by the very authorities who were supposed to protect them. The revelation that a human slaughterhouse had been operating right on the outskirts of their city for over a decade, right under the noses of the local police, completely shattered any remaining trust the public had in the system. The Okada riders, who had shown immense bravery by banding together and marching into the dark woods to save one of their own, were left with a hollow victory. They had saved 23 lives, a truly heroic feat, but they were forced to live with the agonizing knowledge that they could not save their friend Lanre. The silence from the ground where the warehouse once stood remains a heavy, suffocating weight. The concrete and soil of Soka Forest still hold secrets that may never be brought to light, and the families of those who disappeared are left to wonder if their loved ones' final moments were spent in the suffocating dark of an underground cell that was paved over by the hands of the law. It is a haunting reminder of the dark forces that can hide in plain sight and the lengths to which some will go for wealth and power. The stories of the survivors who managed to escape the Soka Forest warehouse serve as a stark testament to the resilience of the human spirits in the face of absolute darkness. These individuals, who were stripped of their clothes, their names, and their basic humanity, have had to walk a long and painful road toward healing. Many of them continue to suffer from severe physical ailments and deep psychological trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. But their survival also stands as a permanent indictment of a broken system that failed them for so many years. The forest may have slowly reclaimed the physical ruins of the warehouse, but the memory of what happened there can never be completely erased. It forces us all to look much more closely at the quiet shadows that exist in our own backyards today. Before you go, just remember this. Somewhere beneath that forest, there may still be voices that were never heard and never will be. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know in the comments and check out the rest of our true crime stories. Because sometimes the scariest stories don't have endings. Until next time. In May 2011, a chilling crime unfolded in the quiet market town of Huddersfield, West Yorkshire, England, that would shock the public and test the absolute limits of human endurance. At the center of this ordeal was Michalina Lewandowska, a 7-year-old Polish national who had moved to the United Kingdom in search of a better life. She was a dedicated mother to her 3-year-old son Jakub, whom she loved more than anything in the world. However, her domestic life was deeply complicated. She shared a volatile on-again, off-again relationship with her boyfriend, Marcin Kasperzak, also 27. The couple had previously been engaged, but the relationship was an exhausting cycle of breaking up and reconciling, rarely maintaining stability for more than a few months at a time. Kasperzak was an aspiring bodybuilder whose obsession with his physical appearance had spiraled into a severe addiction to anabolic steroids. Over time, the heavy steroid abuse altered his personality, fueling a volatile temper, deep-seated paranoia, and an increasingly controlling nature. The relationship had deteriorated to the point where Michalina was actively planning to leave him for good. Rumors had begun circulating that she intended to take their young son and return permanently to Poland. Terrified of losing control and furious at the prospect of his son being taken across Europe, Kasperzak formulated a sinister, meticulously planned plot to permanently eliminate Michalina. The execution of his plan began with a deceptive gesture of goodwill. Knowing that Michalina loved fashion and missed the affection he used to show her, Kasperzak sent her a text message out of the blue asking if he could take her on a shopping trip. Lately, Michalina had been turning down his invitations, instinctively creating distance between them. Her initial reaction was to refuse this request as well. However, she realized that her mother was already looking after little Jakub that afternoon, leaving her with a rare day of absolute free time. Thinking that a shopping trip might provide a peaceful opportunity to talk, or at least offer a pleasant break from her daily routine, she decided to accept. She took a shower, styled her hair, and meticulously got ready for the outing. In a poignant twist of fate, she even decided to slide her diamond engagement ring back onto her finger, a piece of jewelry Kasperzak had given her during happier times, which she had long stopped wearing. A short while later, Kasperzak arrived at her home. When Michelina opened the front door, she welcomed him inside, expecting to head out to the car together. Instead, the moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind him, Kasperzak's demeanor instantly changed from a casual boyfriend to a cold-blooded predator. Without a word, he produced a high-voltage stun gun and tased Michelina directly in the neck and body. The violent electrical current coursed through her muscles, instantly paralyzing her and sending her crashing heavily to the floor. Before she could process the blinding pain or comprehend what was happening, Kasperzak lunged on top of her. He aggressively bound her ankles and her wrists behind her back with heavy-duty packing tape and then stuffed a gag into her mouth to stifle her screams. As she lay completely helpless on the floor, terrified and confused, Kasperzak walked over to the front door, opened it slightly, and signaled to his car parked at the curb. And one 8-year-old accomplice named Patrick Boris emerged from the vehicle and hurried into the house. Together, the muscle-bound bodybuilder and his teenage friend grabbed Michelina and forcibly crammed her into a small, rigid cardboard box that Kasperzak had prepared. The box was so restrictive that Michelina had to be violently compressed into a tight fetal position just to fit inside. Once she was stuffed inside, they folded the cardboard flaps over her, sealed the seams securely with multiple layers of thick packing tape, and carried the box out to the car, slamming it shut inside the trunk. With Michelina trapped in total darkness, the two men got into the front seats and drove toward the remote, rugged outskirts of town. They eventually parked in a secluded lot adjacent to a vast, dense forest. Armed with the cardboard box and 2 heavy shovels they had brought along, Kasperzak and Boris walked deep into the thick woods. They intentionally veered far off the established walking paths, trekking deep into the undergrowth where no casual hiker or passerby would ever venture. When they were satisfied that they were entirely isolated, they dropped the box onto the forest floor. Using their shovels, the two men dug a shallow, narrow grave in the dirt. Once the hole was deep enough, they dragged the cardboard box containing the terrified young mother and dropped it into the earth. Working efficiently, they shoveled the displaced dirt back over the box, burying it completely. To ensure she could never push her way out, they dragged a massive 90-pound log directly over the top of the grave, creating a heavy, suffocating barrier. Believing they had committed the perfect crime, Kasperzak and Boris walked out of the woods, leaving Michelina to die of slow suffocation. Inside the dark, cramped box, Michelina was fully conscious. She could hear the terrifying thuds of dirt landing on the cardboard above her head, followed by the heavy scraping of the log being positioned over her. Her instincts screamed at her to thrash and fight back immediately, but her sharp intellect warned her to stay perfectly still. She knew that if she attempted to escape while her captors were still standing directly above the grave, they would simply hear her, dig her back up, and kill her instantly through far more violent means. Enduring an agonizing, claustrophobic silence, she forced herself to wait a painful amount of time until she was absolutely certain the sound of their footsteps had faded into the distance. When she knew she was entirely alone, a wave of pure adrenaline hit her. She tried desperately to wriggle out of her restraints, but because she was wedged into a strict fetal position with her hands taped tightly behind her back, she lacked the leverage to pull her arms free. The oxygen levels inside the small box were depleting rapidly, and the heat from her own breath made the air thick and unbreathable. As panic threatened to paralyze her mind, her fingers brushed against the diamond engagement ring on her hand. She realized that the sharp, hard edges of the diamonds could act as a makeshift blade. With agonizing effort, she began rubbing and scraping the diamond accents against the thick layers of packing tape binding her wrists. She worked relentlessly, ignoring the friction burns on her skin until she finally felt the structural integrity of the tape give way. With a forceful snap, her hands came free. Now able to move her upper body, she brought her hands to her front and began frantically clawing and punching at the thick cardboard lid directly above her head. The cardboard, weakened slightly by the damp earth pressing down on it, finally tore open. However, breaking the box brought a terrifying new danger. A heavy torrent of loose, dark dirt immediately poured through the opening, burying her face and filling her mouth and nose. Michelina began to choke, her lungs burning for air as she fought off the encroaching darkness of unconsciousness. In that desperate moment, she focused entirely on the thought of her 3-year-old son, Jakob. She knew that if she died in this forest, her son would be left entirely at the mercy of the monstrous man who had put her here. Driven by pure maternal survival instinct, she used her bare hands to dig upward through the collapsing soil, aggressively pushing the heavy dirt aside and fighting the immense weight of the 90-pound log blocking her path. With one final explosive surge of strength, she managed to squeeze her body through a narrow gap beside the log, bursting through the surface of the earth into the open air. Gasping for oxygen, covered in dirt, and bleeding from her fingernails, Michelina dragged herself completely out of her own grave. She stumbled blindly through the dense forest until she reached a nearby roadway where she frantically flagged down a stunned motorist. The driver immediately called the police and comforted her until emergency services arrived on the scene. Marcin Kasperzak was arrested shortly thereafter. He boldly claimed to police that he had merely intended to scare Michelina and never meant to kill her, but the mountain of evidence told a drastically different story. During the trial, the prosecution highlighted the sheer ruthlessness of burying a human being alive in a taped box. The jury ultimately found Marcin Kasperzak guilty of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His teenage accomplice, Patrick Boris, was found guilty of kidnapping and received a sentence of 4.5 years in a young offender institution. Michelina Lewandowska's miraculous escape remains one of the most astonishing examples of human resilience and maternal love, overcoming a calculated act of pure malice. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. In 1932, the United States was tightly gripped by the devastating economic collapse of the Great Depression. While the entire nation suffered, the consequences were felt most acutely by impoverished communities in the deeply segregated American South. In Macon County, Alabama, where over 80% of the population was African American, families lived under the rigid, oppressive rules of Jim Crow segregation. Among them was Charlie Pollard, a 26-year-old black farmer who, like most of his neighbors, lived a life of extreme poverty. He resided in a simple wooden shack that lacked basic necessities like window screens or furniture and slept on piles of laundry spread across the floor. For the men of Macon County, securing any kind of work was a rare blessing, and those fortunate enough to find labor earned less than a single dollar per day. Under such harsh financial conditions, access to professional health care was an unimaginable luxury that none of them could afford. Therefore, when a rumor began circulating through the county that the federal government was sending medical professionals to provide free healthcare exams for African American men, Charlie was thrilled. He had never seen a doctor in his entire life, and the prospect of a free medical checkup seemed like an incredible, life-changing opportunity. Within days, the rumors were confirmed when workers from the U.S. Public Health Service arrived in town and set up a temporary clinic inside a local one-room schoolhouse. Charlie eagerly joined hundreds of other local men lining up outside the building, waiting patiently for his turn. When he finally stepped inside, a health worker informed him that they would be conducting a simple blood test. Charlie willingly rolled up his sleeve, struck out his arm, and trusted that these government officials had his best interests at heart. A few days later, Charlie received the results of his blood work. the medical staff told him that he had tested positive for bad blood. In the rural South at that time, bad blood was a non-medical, colloquial term widely used by locals to describe a massive umbrella of ailments ranging from fatigue and anemia to indigestion. The government workers deliberately kept the details vague, never explaining what the diagnosis actually meant or what specific disease Charlie had contracted. Instead, they quickly pivoted to an enticing offer. Because of his diagnosis, they explained, Charlie was officially eligible to enroll in an exclusive, government-sponsored medical treatment program. If he agreed to participate, the government would provide him with completely free medical care, free transportation to and from the clinic, and a hot, nutritious meal on every examination day. Furthermore, the officials added a final, sobering clause. If he happened to pass away while enrolled in the program, the government would pay his family $50 for burial expenses, provided they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy first. To a dirt-poor farmer facing starvation during the Great Depression, the promise of free hot meals and burial insurance was a massive relief. Deeply trusting the authority and benevolence of the United States government, Charlie signed up without hesitation. He was not alone. Approximately 400 other African-American men from Macon County, mostly uneducated and desperate for aid, joined the program under the exact same pretenses. At the very beginning, the program operated precisely as promised. Charlie and the others would arrive for low-key medical checkups, enjoy their hot meals, take a few routine pills, and undergo standard blood draws. However, the nature of the examinations soon took a surprisingly painful turn. The doctors began subjecting the men to regular, excruciatingly painful spinal taps. The procedures were so invasive that they left the men completely bedridden for weeks at a time, suffering from blinding headaches and severe back pain. The participants had never been informed that spinal taps would be part of the regimen, nor did they understand why they were necessary. Yet, because of their deep-seated respect for the medical establishment and their desire to be cured of their vague bad blood, Charlie and his peers endured the agony without resistance. Tragically, the entire program was built on a monstrous lie. The initiative was not a treatment program at all. It was a covert, highly unethical clinical study, officially known as the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. When the doctors tested Charlie's blood on that very first day, they discovered he had syphilis, a severe, highly contagious bacterial infection that ravages the human body in 3 distinct stages over the course of a lifetime. The Public Health Service had intentionally selected Macon County because the region had an exceptionally high syphilis infection rate of around 35%, and because they knew the impoverished, uneducated population would be incredibly easy to deceive. The true, sinister objective of the study was to observe what happens to the human body when syphilis is left completely untreated until death. The pills and fake treatments given to the men were nothing more than placebos designed to keep them compliant and ensure they kept returning to the clinic. The profound cruelty of the experiment reached a definitive turning point in the 1940s, when penicillin was discovered and recognized worldwide as a highly effective, definitive cure for syphilis. Instead of doing the humane thing and administering the antibiotic to save the lives of the participants, the leaders of the study actively chose to withhold the cure. They went to extreme lengths to ensure the men never found out about penicillin and never received treatment from outside sources, as curing the men would completely ruin their long-term data. When World War II broke out in 1941, Charlie and several other young men in the study attempted to enlist in the military to fight for their country. However, the study's directors intervened, successfully blocking the men from the draft and informing military boards that these individuals were part of a specialized government medical program. This was done solely to prevent military doctors from discovering their syphilis and administering penicillin. As the decades dragged on, the devastating effects of untreated syphilis began to decimate the group. While Charlie was incredibly fortunate because his specific infection had seemingly gone dormant or burned out without causing severe physical deterioration, his friends and neighbors were not so lucky. Men throughout Macon County began developing horrific rashes and open sores across their bodies. Their bones and joints ached constantly, their hair fell out, and they suffered from chronic burning fevers. Over time, the late stages of the disease caused internal tumors to form, disintegrated their skeletal structures, and attacked their central nervous systems, leaving many men completely blind, deaf, paralyzed, or insane before finally killing them. Through it all, the survivors remained completely oblivious to the fact that their own government was intentionally allowing them to rot from the inside out. The deception finally shattered in 1972, a staggering 40 years after the study had first begun. A junior public health assistant named Peter Buxton, who had spent years internally protesting the horrific ethics of the experiment to no avail, finally leaked the classified records of the Macon County program to an investigative journalist. On the 25th of July 1972, the Washington Star broke the story on its front page with a shocking headline exposing that hundreds of syphilis victims had been intentionally left untreated by the government for 4 decades. The public outcry was immediate and immense, forcing the government to abruptly shut down the study. At 66 years old, Charlie Pollard finally learned the horrifying truth about what bad blood actually meant. He realized with profound grief that at least 28 men had died directly from the infection, over 100 had died of related complications, and dozens of wives and children had been inadvertently infected. Feeling completely betrayed by the country he respected, Charlie contacted a civil rights lawyer and filed a massive lawsuit against the federal government. The case resulted in an out-of-court settlement where the government agreed to provide free, lifetime medical care to the survivors and their families, along with a cash payout of $38,000 to each of the 74 remaining survivors. Armed with his compensation, Charlie quietly returned to his simple life as a farmer in Macon County, carrying the heavy memory of the friends he had lost to one of the darkest medical scandals in American history, until he passed away peacefully on April 29, 2000, at the exceptional age of 94. The kidnapping and murder of Mark Kilroy. In March 1989, 4 young college students from East Texas packed their bags and embarked on a road trip to South Padre Island, a highly popular resort town nestled just off the southern coast of Texas. Like tens of thousands of other American students that year, they were eager to celebrate their annual spring break by soaking up the sun on the beach, unwinding from the stress of university life, and enjoying the vibrant local nightlife. After enduring a grueling 9-hour drive across the state, the exhausted friends arrived late at night and went straight to sleep. The following morning, they hit the beach to enjoy some drinks and soak in the vacation atmosphere. By the afternoon, looking to elevate their spring break experience with a bit of international adventure, the 4 friends decided they would cross the border into Mexico to experience the nightlife in the city of Matamoros, a destination famous for its cheap drinks, lively dance clubs, and relaxed regulations. That evening, they piled into their car and drove roughly an hour southwest to the border town of Brownsville, Texas. They parked their vehicle on the American side and walked across the international footbridge spanning the Rio Grande River, stepping directly into the bustling streets of Matamoros, Mexico. Their first night was an absolute success. They grabbed a quick bite to eat at a local burger joint before diving into the crowded bars and clubs, dancing and drinking for hours before safely returning to their hotel in South Padre Island. Having had so much fun, they decided to repeat the exact same itinerary the very next night. Once again, they drove down to the border, crossed the footbridge, and immersed themselves in the high-energy party scene. However, by the time they decided to call it a night and head back to the United States, the streets of Matamoros had become overwhelmingly congested with thousands of rowdy tourists, The sea of people was so dense that navigating the sidewalks was nearly impossible, causing the four friends to naturally split into two separate pairs to maneuver through the crowd. The lead pair moved quickly through the mass of people, eventually making it to a gift shop located right at the foot of the International Bridge, where they stood and waited for their companions to catch up. The trailing pair consisted of 21-year-old pre-med student Mark Kilroy and his close friend Bill Huddleston. As they walked, Mark suddenly spotted a young woman standing near a house whom he had chatted with earlier in the night. Wanting to briefly say goodbye to her, Mark stepped out of the flow of the crowd to approach her. Seeing that Mark was occupied, Bill took the opportunity to quickly step down a dark adjacent alleyway to urinate. The entire detours took no more than a few moments, but when Bill emerged from the alleyway, both Mark and the girl were completely gone. Assuming that Mark had finished his conversation and simply walked ahead to join the other two friends at the bridge, Bill didn't panic. He walked up to the gift shop and met with the rest of the group, but his heart sank when he asked where Mark was, and the others replied that they hadn't seen him at all. Growing increasingly concerned, the trio backtracked into the chaotic crowd to search for their missing friend. They returned to the exact spot where Mark had been talking to the girl, but the area was empty. Trying to rationalize the situation, they convinced themselves that Mark must have already crossed the border on his own and was likely waiting for them at their parked car on the Texas side. The three friends crossed the bridge, but when they reached the vehicle, Mark was nowhere to be found. Desperate for answers, they drove all the way back to their hotel room in South Padre Island, clinging to the hope that he had taken a taxi back with the girl. When morning arrived and Mark's bed remained empty, they knew something was terribly wrong. They immediately rushed to the local police station to file a missing person report. At first, authorities failed to take the case seriously, as hundreds of spring breakers went missing every year, only to turn up 24 hours later with a massive hangover and a hazy memory. But as a full day passed without a single word from Mark, law enforcement realized this was not a typical case of a partying student. American and Mexican police launched a joint investigation, deeply aware that Matamoros held a dangerous underbelly, but with absolutely no leads, the case quickly began to languish. The horrifying truth behind Mark Kilroy's disappearance would not come to light until 3 weeks later, entirely by coincidence. Just outside of Matamoros, a drug smuggler made the fatal mistake of speeding right through a routine police checkpoint without stopping. A high-speed police pursuit ensued, leading authorities deep into a rugged, rural, mountainous area where the suspect finally stopped at a secluded ranch known as Santa Elena. After taking the smuggler into custody, the police noticed a local ranch worker standing nearby. On a complete whim, one of the officers pulled out a photograph of Mark Kilroy and asked the worker if he had ever seen the young American. Terrified and trembling, the worker looked at the photo and nodded, admitting that he had indeed seen the boy. He explained that the drug smuggler and his associates had brought Mark to the ranch in handcuffs weeks prior. The worker then slowly turned and pointed up the hillside toward a small, isolated wooden shack about 400 yards away, stating that was where they had taken him. As the heavily armed authorities began to hike up the mountain toward the shack, they noticed a large, ominous metal cauldron sitting prominently on the front stoop. When they closed within 50 yards of the structure, they were suddenly hit by an overwhelming, stomach-turning stench of death and decay. Stepping inside the shack, the officers discovered a scene of such raw, visceral horror that even the most seasoned, grizzled law enforcement veterans were left completely shaken to their core. Under aggressive interrogation, the captured drug smuggler broke down and confessed to the entire nightmare. He revealed that his organization was not just a cartel, but a highly organized, dangerous cult led by a charismatic and sadistic Cuban-born man named Adolfo Constanzo. Constanzo practiced a heavily distorted, dark version of an Afro-Caribbean religion called Palo Mayombe, fusing it with his own twisted beliefs to form a black magic cult. Constanzo convinced his followers that by performing ritualistic human sacrifices, the gods would grant them supernatural power, absolute invincibility against rival gangs, and complete invisibility from law enforcement. Crucially, Constanzo taught them that the sacrifices could not be quick or painless. The victims had to endure extreme torture and die screaming, as the cult believed that the greater the agony inflicted before death, the more powerful the spiritual protection would be. Mark Kilroy had been target of opportunity for this madness. On the night of his disappearance, while Bill was in the alleyway, a man in a red pickup truck pulled up to Mark and called him over under the guise of needing directions or help. Being a naturally kind and helpful young man, Mark walked over to the vehicle. The moment he reached the window, two cult members jumped out from a nearby building and aggressively tried to wrestle him into the truck. Mark, who was a tall, athletic, and physically fit young man, managed to violently fight the two men off and broke into a dead sprint down the street. Tragically, he only made it 2 blocks before a second vehicle filled with cult members cut him off. At gunpoint, they forced Mark into the car, bound him, and drove him out of Matamoros to the remote ranch. Mark was held captive in the back of a car overnight, and the next morning, the cult members wrapped thick duct tape entirely around his face and eyes, leaving only a tiny slit for his nostrils so he could breathe. They marched the terrified, blindfolded college student up the hill to the sacrificial shack. Mark spent several agonizing hours being subjected to unspeakable atrocities by Constanzo and his fanatical followers. Finally, Constanzo brought the nightmare to an end by striking Mark in the back of the neck with a heavy machete. The depravity did not end with his death. Following their ritualistic protocols, the cult members surgically removed Mark's brain and placed it inside their sacred cauldron, known as a prenda, where it was boiled alongside animal blood, sticks, and old bones to create what they believed was a magical protective brew. They then severed his legs and inserted a long, sturdy wire directly into his spinal column, fishing it through his torso before burying his remains in a shallow grave next to the shack. They left the end of the wire protruding up out of the dirt like a lead, intending to use it later to easily pull his decomposed bones out of the earth so they could fashion them into ritualistic jewelry and good luck charms for the cartel members. A systematic excavation of the Santa Elena Ranch unearthed the remains of Mark Kilroy, alongside 14 other victims who had been lured, tortured, and sacrificed in a similar fashion. Investigators estimate that Adolfo Constanzo and his cult were responsible for the ritualistic murders of anywhere between 16 and 26 individuals, many of whom were rival drug dealers or innocent bystanders who simply possessed good spiritual energy, according to the cult leader. When the police finally tracked Constanzo down to an apartment complex in Mexico City a short time later, a violent shootout erupted. Rather than facing justice and spending the rest of his life in a prison cell, Constanzo ordered one of his own loyal followers to turn an automatic rifle on him and open fire, killing him before authorities could breach the room. 5 of the surviving high-ranking cult members were successfully captured, stood trial for their horrific roles in the mass murders, and were each sentenced to over 60 years in prison. Mark Kilroy's tragic fate remains a dark and harrowing chapter in criminal history, illustrating the terrifying depths of human fanaticism and the absolute randomness of evil. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim Tom Myers had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGeehan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGeehan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGeehan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so Clement, he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so, at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGahan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Cherish sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, the more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th-floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.